Let's get started. I'm hoping you're now all seeing some slides. Uh, Firstly,
Yep.
a welcome from myself and from Ruth, my fellow director in Epion. Um, I founded Epion 4.5 years ago. We are a specialist change consultancy. We enable effective change by empowering those who are impacted by it. We blend together capabilities across change management, communication, creative design, training, learning, project management, strategy, and a few more, looking to treat those capabilities as ingredients in a recipe and blending them together in the particular way that individual clients value. Thank you for joining us. We are recording this, just so you would know, with a view to being able to share it afterwards, both with yourselves, if of interest, and with others who expressed interest in the webinar but haven't been able to join us. What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about enabling changes if people really mattered. And from that, you might pick up some skepticism on our part about whether in every instance, people-centric change approaches are as people-centric or as human-centric as they might claim to be. What we're going to talk about, we're going to talk through what do we mean by effective change in any case. We're going to talk about the implications of trying to think about adoption first and foremost. We're going to flow from that into what are the implications for us as change leaders of taking a human or people-centric approach. We'll wonder about whether change resistance is a bit too easy a phrase to use. We'll think a little bit about resilience and why that's not the same as boiling frogs. And then we'll pull it all together and open it up for your reactions, for questions, for discussion. I'll take about 20 minutes going through, so we should have by then about 20 minutes left for discussion. Worth saying that, and please do put any questions you think of as we go along in the chat, so we're primed to pick them up as we get to the back end. Worth saying what I'm not doing here is trying to rubbish other approaches to change, nor am I trying to give you a coherent and comprehensive methodology. Rather, what I'm trying to do is throw a few thoughts out that might prompt some thinking about whether we need a different mindset if we're to be truly people-centric in change, and what that might look like in some facets, and what it might mean for how we go about doing change. Also worth saying, I think it's a mindset that aligns better with that stream of thinking that says change is the one constant going forward, and that organizations need not just to think about lots of change initiatives and transformations as discrete initiatives or programs, but rather to be thinking about change capability going forward as a norm. So to set the context, you'll know the question of what is the change challenge, and there's a spoiler there about how we think about it. We talk about enabling effective change. Well, what is effective change? For us, it's change that delivers the return on the investment that is being sought. It's change that delivers the benefits that have been identified and are being targeted with the initiative. And we know that change initiatives still fail, and I can put up a range of quotes and factors and research here, but most change initiatives are still failing. Most or many don't pay sufficient attention to the people, which we consider to be the most important factor. That knocks on not just in an unsuccessful or a suboptimal change initiative, but into adoption or confusion and longer term impacts as people leave or retention becomes a challenge, and it's getting more difficult. So there's a sense that the change is hard. What do we think the key word or the key phrase or the key emphasis is here? It's that second last word on that second McKinsey or last McKinsey quote, adoption. Because while uh, effective change, it might be necessary that you deliver really differentiated, leading edge, industry leading software functionality. That's never going to be sufficient. It might be that you are able to define and deploy streamlined process and real role clarity with interfaces ever so well defined. That's not going to be sufficient for effective change. Ditto casting a wonderful vision of a future culture. Because these are all about delivering things, whereas change is about people adopting. Change is about people behaving differently, perhaps thinking differently. And that's not something you can easily deliver, we don't think. Adoption is the key word. It's the change being adopted, because if people don't start using the new systems, following the new processes, working in the new roles, intentionally heading towards the new culture, behaving differently, perhaps thinking and feeling differently, then the changes that are being sought will not be embedded, the benefits will not flow, the return on investment will not be realized. What might that mean then if we were to try and take an adoption mindset? What implications would it be for those of us who are change practitioners or change leaders? Well, firstly, it means that those activities that work with the people, the ones that are badged typically as change management or as business change, cannot be an add-on. Most often, where we're invited to support clients, we get brought in where there is a clear schedule, a clear program plan or a transformation plan, and we're asked to help it land well. That's very different from one program we worked on where the program director was really, really clear that what they were looking for was adoption of some new ways of working and of some new technology. And as a result of that, we were involved in shaping what would go live when and where and how. Because if the ultimate aim is adoption, then you're going to take into account the human factors, where the people are at, how they're feeling, how you can phase support for them, how you can help them embrace it, how you can build campaigns or other interventions around that. And that's going to drive some of your timing, not just the technology's ready, or this is convenient for tech support, or this is what makes sense in terms of volumes for the program team. So change activities, business change activities, change management can't be an add-on. Secondly, those change activities have to face outwards, not inwards. What do I mean by that? What I mean is if our fundamental concern is, are those impacted by change going to be able to adopt it? Are they going to be equipped to adopt that change? Are they going to do so? How can we enable that? Then we need a resolute focus on them, not, as we've seen in some instances, those who are change practitioners doing business change, doing change management, dragged in to face the PMO with a fundamental focus on governance artifacts. It's important that we know we've done change impact assessments. Of course it is. It's important that we've done stakeholder mapping, assessments, analysis. We've got plans for that. It's important that we do benefit mapping, but it's not about providing artifacts to a PMO so somebody can tick a box. It's so we can do a better job as we face outwards and work with those who are impacted by the change. We've said, and just to reiterate, that an adoption mindset means we're concerned with effecting changes in what people are doing, perhaps even thinking and believing. And that means we'd suggest that change activity cannot but be human, relational, and facilitative in nature. Because if what we're about is people who come with a whole set of feelings and thoughts and past experience and concerns and hopes, are going to change their behaviors, that's not something you deliver. That's something which might be an outcome of a program, and in that loose sense of the word, it's a delivery. But it's not like delivering a new piece of software. It's not like deploying a new process. It's about working with human beings who have a degree of autonomy about what they do and how they do it. And so we need to be relational, and we'd suggest facilitative. That's why we talk about enabling change more than we talk about managing it. And it's why we talk about empowering those who are impacted by change uh, as lying at the heart of what enabling change means. And again, I'm very aware that I'm kind of giving you one side of a coin, trying to get a mindset shift by prompting it. It is not an attempt to rubbish everything else that is there as good and helpful practice. If we take an adoption mindset, then there's a question that arises from that about how do we lead as change leaders and change practitioners to enable change? Are there other people who are good at helping, facilitating, enabling changes in behaviors and what people think or do? Well, there's that whole spectrum from mentoring through coaching through to counseling and therapy. And research shows that the single most important factor in determining the likely outcome of therapy, of talking therapy, of counseling, is the quality and the nature of the relationship between the counselor and the counselee. And I wonder if we as change leaders might therefore think about, okay, what's our relationship like with those who are impacted by the change? If that's going to be important in helping people change. While that's true about the quality and nature of the relationship being key across all counseling modalities, different kinds, whether it's Jungian, Freudian, psychotherapy, psychodynamic counseling, or whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or whatever, in person-centered approaches, those kind of follow on from a guy called Carl Rogers. The counselor seeks to adopt three what are called core conditions that determine and shape the nature of the relationship with the counselee. And the first of them is empathy, looking to feel what the client, what the counselee is feeling, looking to really walk in their shoes, to get their perspective and to understand what feelings arise from their perspective. You might think again, there's an obvious link there to, well, do we really know for those particularly out on the front line, somewhere we have a sweet spot, those who are putting spades in ground, for example, those who are facing off to the public every day, do we get what their job feels like? Do we get how they're feeling before we start introducing them to transformational change? Secondly, congruence. What we are and what we appear to be are the same. So there's no acting, there's no spinning as we message and tell stories. There's being genuine, there's being honest, being what we seem to be, so that people can trust us as we seek to bring them through change, facilitate them adopting change. And then finally, the one that is perhaps the hardest, if you're ahead of me, you'll have spotted that this one might at times seem to be in conflict with congruence, but unconditional positive regard for the client in therapy. Unconditional positive regard means that we're not judging the people we're working with. We're not approving or disapproving of them either way, and we're not thinking of them as being the problem. And I wonder if very often we drift in change initiatives, in transformations, into viewing those who are impacted by the change as being the problem. And this is an encouragement to not think that way, to see it differently. That last one's the hardest. There are people who are impacted by change who we want to enable and empower and equip to adopt change, who frankly will make our lives hell at times. That's clear and fair. But can we bring a mindset that is more empathetic, more congruent, and more characterized by unconditional positive regard? And if we did so, how might our practice as change leaders alter? if we were adopting these kind of postures? Might that help us enable change? My instinct and our experience is that it will, and it does. If we're adopting unconditional positive regard as a posture, as a stance we want to have, what are the implications of that for change resistance? How does it fit with the idea of change resistance? And I wonder if change resistance is a bit too easy, actually. I don't mean dealing with it, I don't mean addressing it, but I mean as a concept, it's a bit too easy, at times a little bit lazy, perhaps. I think it's typically characterized by saying these people are disengaged or are pushing against the change, so they're resisting the change. We need to do more to engage them, so our engagement becomes more creative, more thorough, more consistent, more far-reaching, which on a bad day might frankly feel like we're shouting a bit louder at them. You know, if the proverbial Frenchman does not speak English, they're not going to understand it better if we shout louder. It's that kind of a model. And if that's not working, we need resistance management plans and resistance management interventions, which can feel a bit like shouting louder. And to be clear, I think many of the things that are badged as resistance management are just good practice that you do anyway as you're working in change, rather than things that are specifically about resistance. So you might think of things like, you know, if you look at classic change resistance tactics, strategies, it's making sure your communications are clear and give the reason for the change and establish dialogue. It's things like making sure training and support are thorough. It's things like involving those who are impacted by the change in shaping some elements of how the change is done. It's about acknowledging their feelings. All of these things and many more are just good things that you actually, I think, would be doing anyway. Rather than as specifically badged as resistance management. Here's another way of thinking about it. What if we said our people are disengaged and or are pushing against the change? And you'll note I've changed the word these people to our people, deliberately so, to make a point. Well, that looks suspiciously like fight or flight or freeze, where fight is resisting the change actively, and flight or freeze are being disengaged. Well, maybe they feel threatened because those are typical threat responses for human beings. Maybe they're under stress, under pressure. Maybe they've experienced something traumatic. That was something which made sense as a conversation post-COVID, for example. But even still, in some of the readjustments we've made since then, there's still stress from that. But maybe people are feeling threatened. We know that people who feel threatened have a reduced, what you might call, window of tolerance. Their ability to cope with things outside their norm and to engage with it is reduced. They've got a reduced attentional capacity. Their ability to engage with things beyond their day-to-day norms are reduced. They feel psychologically unsafe. And research says that the most important factor in how psychologically safe people feel in the workplace is line manager behavior. So what if we worked with line managers, helping them to behave in ways that boost psychological safety? What if we paid more attention to soft skills? If we paid more attention to good practice, rather than putting in place change resistance tactics on one particular program? Well, one thing it would do clearly is it won't just impact one change initiative, but actually it's going to grow organizational change capacity, because we're dealing with the root causes of why some people are resisting change or are disengaged from it. And again, I'm not rubbishing the things that get badged as, you know, resistance management tactics, because they're good things we should be doing anyway. I'm just suggesting that maybe if we came at it with a different mindset, we would do better in moving forward and in seeing change adopted as the key thing. If resistance isn't something we want to think about, is part of the capacity for change about resilience? We think so, but we think it's not about boiling frogs. What do I mean by that? Well, resilience, here's a definition of resilience from dictionary.com. And you see some key words in there about returning to original form after being bent or compressed, ability of a person to recover from something, from an event or a period of time, the ability of an organization to respond or to recover from something that has happened. So it's not about resilience, is about bouncing back. It's not about being constantly under pressure. And so resilience isn't about, and this is where the boiling frogs come in. I hear a lot from those in organizations saying we need our people to be more resilient. And my fear is not that they mean we want to equip our people to bounce back from periods which are more pressured, are more stressful, but rather they mean we want our people to be able to withstand ever increasing demands through time. We want them to be stronger. We want them to be more robust. We want them to be stoic. But actually, resilience is about recovery. It's about returning to original state. It's about bouncing back. And there's a lot of things out there to build resilience. We've used, I'm very happy with, I like some short course formats that an organization called Minerva, with whom we've worked in the past, have able to deploy, which I've seen work well in frontline as well as in office situations. But again, how often do we, when we're doing transformational initiatives, transformation programs, change programs, look at deploying resilience building resources ahead of getting underway with a change? Great things to do while we're planning some of the detail of what is going to be delivered and what we will want people to adopt over time. So, summing up, there's more to people-centered change than just doing change journeys. I love ADKAR. I love our own version of it about engaging, envisioning, equipping, and then helping to embrace and helping to embed. But there's much more to people-centered change than that. It's about a mindset, I'd suggest. It's got an impact on how we set up our major programs, our transformation programs, not just how we do change interventions along the side, let alone as an afterthought. It raises questions about how we lead change, I'd suggest, and the kind of language we use about adoption, about facilitating and empowering, more perhaps than about delivering or deploying. And it's about, do we enable change or do we manage change? And then finally, just another example of resistance or resilience. So again, not trying to give you an overwhelming, an overarching, comprehensive methodology, just trying to prompt some thoughts. And a final one for you. As change leaders, maybe how we relate to those who are being impacted by change is as important as what we do. Just a thought. That's what I wanted to run through, to throw out as ideas, and I'd love to have your reactions to them and questions as well. So Andrew, you've asked a question around, would we recommend prioritizing leadership behaviors when developing a resistance management plan? And you're thinking in a large matrix organization. I think yes. I think I'm certainly we're comfortable with some of the complexities and nuances that go with both and rather than either or. And so we might say, yeah, let's be working on psychological safety with line managers. Let's be working on resilience with those who are going to be impacted by the change. And let's be working on leadership behaviors with those at the top of the organization or the top of the function if it's very self-contained. Because over time, I think organizations take on the character of their leaders. Andrew, you got your hand up.
Yeah, no, thank you, Nick. I guess the reason I put the question in the chat is I think quite often executive leadership intent can get lost in the hierarchy of a structured management
Yes,
approach, so that the intent
yes,
of senior leaders is absolutely the change is necessary, but that can
yes,
get lost through all those different levels of leadership.
yes. I think that's right. Whether that's about, I remember one organization, somebody talking to me about the chief executive being relentlessly dissatisfied, and helping that chief executive to empathize with. And I get that, if you're a chief executive, you need to get the organization stretching and growing and shifting. Um, but I do think that helping that chief exec to empathize with what it felt like on the front line was probably something that would have made a lot of sense. I'm wondering about other reactions, questions, thoughts.
Can I just ask a question, Steve Winfield?
Steve, hi.
Let's talk about the type of consulting that you do. How often does that human intervention move into the space of operations consulting? And the reason that I ask that question is you're led by the psychology of it, change management, that sort of thing. How often does that progress into moving on to that ops platform?
So I think, and Ruth, you might have a perspective to come in behind me here, but I think in terms of stuff we ourselves do, not something we typically get involved in, because it's not what we do well, and we want to do what we do well. I think that said, we are typically very well involved in the operations, because it's the people in operations often who are impacted. And so we're dealing with those people, building relationships with those people. And it becomes very difficult not to get to know the details of what they're doing. We're at one project at the moment, we're deep in the heart of rostering. Another project, we're getting deep in the heart of procurement and commercial and procurement processes. There clearly are knock-on things. It's not something we ourselves directly get involved in typically.
The reason I ask is I like your approach in terms of it not the human element not being an add-on to a project. It's got to be an integrated approach that says that we have a structure from A to Z that unlocks X, Y, and Z value on the human element, the process element, the systems element, that sort of the behavioral component. And I think that these two things work very well hand in glove, and I have opinions on that.
You may be helping us think forward that rather than saying to those who are coming with transformation initiatives, hey, you need to be thinking about this in from the front, and you need therefore to be building capability for change in the organization as an ongoing thing. But actually that then feeds you into shaping the kind of initiatives you might do operationally as well. So yeah, that makes sense to me. Thank you. Alex.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on one of your slides that said taking an adoption mindset. And I'm sort of just brief context, I guess. I come from the SAP S/4HANA change transformation space. So in that context, there are a suite of actions, change adoption or change management actions that we would often engage and drive with a client, whether it's around your change networks, your change impact, and you mentioned some of those things. So when you're talking about the taking a change adoption mindset, is that in the context of having that early conversation with the leadership to help them understand or appreciate the importance of adoption to invest in change? Or are you saying that by taking that adoption mindset, you would do things differently from a program action perspective, whether it's change networks or change impacts, the usual traditional things that we all sometimes get a bit siloed in doing? I kind of put the smiley face up when you said the PMO wants to see
I noticed.
done. That's what I was laughing at, because there's the balance between governance and the impact to the business. So just to kind of recap, I guess I was just trying to get a bit more elaboration from you about what you mean by taking the adoption mindset, and what material difference does that have on what we do on programs.
So I think it's a both and to your do we get to leaders, does it shape how we would work on the kind of the program activities? We would, and you know, do we always get in early enough with clients to shape things that way? Not always, no, of course not. But I would want to be setting up given absolute freedom. I'd want to be setting up the program with those who are leading it, to be starting with those who you want to have using the new ERP or the upgraded ERP. I would then, in terms of detail of what I might be doing differently down the line, I might be getting out to those people and looking to build relationships with them, understanding. I mean, I absolutely get that if you introduce a new ERP system, compared to introducing new digital tools, then there is there's no optionality about using the ERP system compared to the optionality of working digitally with take some of the AI tools, for example, that are out there at the moment. But there is such a thing as malevolent compliance, where people will start using a new system. They will be compliant, but frankly, they are peed off that you have got them to go through this. They don't like it. They will not use it well. They will do the minimum. And I think getting out there in the way in which one builds relationship with them at the outset, understanding not just impact on them in terms of system, process, people, information, and the usual categories, but understanding where they're coming from in terms of what they've been through recently and other changes, understanding their mindset towards it. It seemed to be important there. So I think it would be both and. Ruth, sorry, you wanted to add.
Well, I just was going to build on what you were saying, Nick. So I'm Ruth. I'm Nick's colleague and co-director, just for context. I think particularly with systems implementations, and in fact, most change types, the project team will tend to start with what the product can do, rather than what the organization needs and what the individuals using that particular system need. And those are not always the same thing. So what the organization might need is better productivity. That's a term you hear a lot. But from an end user perspective, that often means getting paid the same amount to do more work. So that might be in the organization's best interest, but not necessarily in the best interest of the end users. So I think by taking that human-centered approach, we would tend to start with what does the organization need to do well, and what's stopping it do that. And from an end user perspective, what does each individual user need to do well, or to do their job well, and what's stopping them currently doing that? And to your point, I think it was Andrew, there's going to be an element of technology, there's going to be an element of process, and there's going to be an element of behavior in order to facilitate those business outcomes and those end user outcomes. So I think taking that human-centered approach can be really helpful, particularly in the big picture. Rather than going, how are we going to configure this system to tick, 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 thinking, okay, what are the business outcomes? What are the user outcomes that we're looking to achieve? And how do we remove blockers, both organizationally and for day-to-day working operations, to enable and facilitate people to do a good job, to do what they need to do? And ultimately, I think when you do that, perhaps I'm being hopelessly naive, but I think most people want to do a good job. And mostly people get angry and annoyed because there are things stopping them doing that. Most people do come to work thinking, they're not lazy, they're not stupid, they're not resistant, but they come to work and they've got all of these blockers. And so when you can help remove those, I think there's often a lot of positive sentiment that gets unlocked if you approach it, as Nick says, with that kind of empathy and people perspective.
Any other thoughts?
I think Daryl's.
Daryl, you've got something. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Interesting, thank you. Just just a thought around if I'm kind of sensing it correctly. Is this take your existing kind of change management activity and do more with it? So it's incremental. We need to do more than we are currently doing, or is it change what we are currently doing? Because I'm kind of thinking large corporate feels like it's a little bit more personal. It feels like it's a little bit more touch points on a one-to-one relationship piece to get the adoption model to work. Does that impact time and or cost, or is it just a switch of time and cost from stopping doing certain things to doing other things? Just trying to understand that kind of time and cost implication of this.
Really good. I think it's more of a switch than it is of a doing more necessarily. So, for example, if one decided that instead of majoring on growing the engagement activities, one was going to invest a little bit up front in working with line managers around psychological safety. That's a transference of activity and resource. I think it's something that can work in large organizations. I remember one project where I ended up talking to a night shift near Plymouth. Now, they were not the most fundamental people we needed to reach if adoption was going to be successful in and of themselves. And we certainly did not intend to go to every one of their equivalents nationally. But the fact that we had gone where nobody ever went kind of got word of mouth around the organization that this was a bit different. So I think working visibly with people to build relationship. It doesn't mean you have to go out to every depot, to every every maintenance office. You have to reach physically every single person in the organization, but you would want them to feel there is some connection with them. But you want to establish a pattern that demonstrates that you're taking them seriously. I think, and that's why it needn't necessarily mean lots more activity, but activity that's focused.
If I may just add to that, Nick, sorry, I'm jumping
please.
in and stealing time, but I think it's also about when you spend the money.
Yes.
I think that what we often see is organisations that deprioritize that human element up front, and then they pay for it later, because you deploy a system that if you don't get your requirements right, the system isn't going to meet the needs of the organisation. It's not going to have the right functionality. It's not going to have the right functionality. It's not going to be used in the right way, or you're going to end up paying for a system where only a tiny fraction of the absolute must-have functionality is used, and you lose out all the benefits that were originally part of the business case of all of this value-added activity. Because if you don't engage people, they will do the absolute bare minimum that they can possibly get away with. They're not going to be doing all of that extra funky whizzy stuff that you may have been intending as an outcome or as a business benefit. And it's far harder to get people engaged once you've lost them than it is to do that up front.
I think a lot of this, I'm a great believer that you set up either vicious or virtuous cycles. And we have to break out of the pattern of initiatives, transformations that don't get to the end and don't work, because all you do is train the organization to not pay much attention to the next one that comes along, because they know it's going to be abandoned before it gets to the end, and you build a repeating pattern. I'm not trying to draw a line and say this is going to be different and see something targeted through and establish a pattern. That feels like an important thing as well. I'm aware we're in our kind of last 4 minutes of our scheduled time. So any other thoughts, comments, questions?
If there isn't another, I'm just going to jump in. I'm curious. You talked about change resistance, right? In sort of change investment on transformation programs, we talk a lot about sort of effectiveness and measurement. So there can be different types of readiness measurement frameworks, and you sort of measure and report dashboards, both qualitative and quantitative, so on and so forth. So I just wondered about change resistance. And what's your view on measuring that? You know, one sort of, you know, element of experience I've got is around sort of understanding who your senior stakeholders are, who are, you know, who might be negative or non-supportive, and there's a bit of a measurement in that kind of sense. But do you have a different view on how you might represent and sort of put your finger on this is our area or this is our change resistance, and how you've kind of represented that? I'm not trying to be difficult. I know it's a bit of a challenging area, right? I think it's quite hard to measure and make change quantifiable, which often helps. But
so I think I might be measuring not resistance per se, but measuring the extent to which we're seeing the opposite. So I like kind of touch points, you know, so you where you get the chance to do a touch point with people who are impacted by change, kind of some way of them very quickly feeding back a smiley face, very happy face through to a really miserable face, or a 1 to 5 engaged, and tracking that along a change journey. You know, asking the question. So if one was to take an ADKAR model, the first step is about how aware are you, and then you'd say, how do you feel about it to relate to the desire? Then you'd be asking, do you know enough? Do you feel you're able to do? And kind of checking, are people moving along? One would look at the levels of responses one gets, as well as the nature of the responses one gets, I think. So I'd be doing that as well, I think.
Cool. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Anything else? Last call. Well, thank you for joining. Really appreciate you joining. I'll drop the slides to each of you who've joined. I will be in touch to see if you would want the recording as well, to share that with you if you'd want that. So look forward to being in touch with each of you, but please do, you know, chase us if anything more pressing comes up before we get to you. Thank you. Really appreciate you joining us, and hope it's been of value.